In March 1919, a single legislative decision passed in London and ratified in Delhi reshaped the political fate of the Indian subcontinent. The British Empire, exhausted by 4 years of total war in Europe and fearful of unrest across its colonial holdings, enacted a law designed not to govern, but to control. The Rowlatt Acts extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime India, authorizing detention without trial, censorship of the press, and the suspension of legal protections for an entire population. The immediate outcome was mass resistance, imperial repression, and the permanent collapse of British moral authority in India. The long-term consequence was irreversible. The British Raj entered its terminal phase, and Indian independence became no longer a question of if, but when. By early 1919, the British Empire stood victorious yet strategically weakened. The First World War had consumed unprecedented resources. India had supplied over 1.3 million soldiers to imperial campaigns across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Indian revenues had financed logistics, equipment, and transport. In return, British officials had issued calculated promises of gradual political reform. These promises were deliberately ambiguous, designed to secure wartime loyalty without committing to structural change. When the war ended in November 1918, the imperial center faced a dilemma. Demobilization risked unrest, reform risked loss of control. The decision was made to prioritize security over consent. The political atmosphere in India was already volatile. Wartime inflation had reduced purchasing power. Agricultural production had been redirected to serve imperial supply chains. Returning soldiers encountered unemployment and administrative indifference. Revolutionary groups, influenced by events in Russia and Ireland, were active but fragmented. British intelligence assessments exaggerated their cohesion and reach. What mattered was not their actual capacity, but the fear they generated within the colonial administration. To the government of India, unrest was not a social condition to be managed, but a threat to be neutralized. In this context, the Rowlatt Committee, chaired by Justice Sidney Rowlatt, was tasked with recommending post-war security legislation. Its findings dismissed the distinction between wartime necessity and peacetime legality. The committee concluded that extraordinary powers were still required to prevent anarchical and revolutionary movements. On this basis, the Imperial Legislative Council passed the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919, commonly known as the Rowlatt Acts. Despite unanimous opposition from Indian members, the decree authorized the colonial state to imprison individuals without charge, conduct trials without juries, restrict movement, and suppress publications. Habeas corpus protections were effectively nullified. These powers were not targeted at specific regions or organizations. They applied across British India to a population exceeding 300 million. From a strategic standpoint, the law represented a shift from indirect rule through cooperation to direct rule through coercion. It signaled that political loyalty would no longer be negotiated, only enforced. British strategic objectives were explicit. India was the keystone of imperial logistics. Its ports supported naval operations. Its railways enabled troop mobility across Asia. Its revenues underwrote imperial debt. Any disruption to internal order threatened Britain's global position at a moment when rivals were reassessing power balances. London prioritized stability over legitimacy, assuming that compliance could be restored through legal authority backed by force. Indian political leadership interpreted the decree differently. For moderates, the Rowlatt Acts represented a betrayal of wartime assurances. For radicals, they confirmed that constitutional methods had reached their limits. Mohandas Gandhi, until then an advocate of loyalty within the imperial framework, declared nationwide opposition. His strategy was not insurrection, but mass non-cooperation. The objective was to withdraw consent without triggering armed conflict, thereby exposing the coercive nature of colonial rule. The British response revealed the structural logic of empire. Peaceful resistance was categorized as sedition. Demonstrations were met with bans. Leaders were arrested preemptively. Communication networks were monitored. The colonial administration relied on legal instruments supported by military readiness. Troop deployments increased in major cities. Rail hubs and telegraph lines were secured. The infrastructure of empire was treated as a battle space. The confrontation reached its decisive moment in April 1919 in Punjab, a province of strategic importance due to its recruitment base for the British Indian Army. Martial law conditions were imposed. Public gatherings were prohibited. On April 13, British Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered troops to fire on an unarmed assembly at Jallianwala Bagh. Official figures listed 379 dead. Independent estimates exceeded 1,000. The massacre was not an isolated failure of discipline. It was the logical outcome of a system that equated authority with force and dissent with rebellion. From an imperial perspective, the operation was intended as deterrence. Dyer later stated that his objective was not crowd control, but moral submission. The logic was explicit. Fear would restore order. However, the strategic effect was the opposite. News of the killings spread rapidly despite censorship. The legitimacy of British rule suffered irreversible damage. The Hunter Commission later condemned Dyer's actions, but stopped short of systemic accountability. This reinforced Indian perceptions that colonial law existed to protect power, not justice. The Rowlatt Acts thus became a symbol not of security, but of domination. The law itself was administrative, procedural, and bureaucratic. Its power lay not in rhetoric, but in reach. It transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled from contractual to unilateral. The Indian public did not respond with immediate revolt. Instead, there was widespread withdrawal from imperial institutions. Courts were boycotted, titles returned, and cooperation suspended. This silent resistance deprived the Raj of its operational foundation. Structurally, the decree marked the end of the illusion of partnership. Before 1919, British governance relied on intermediaries, princes, landlords, and professional elites. After Rowlatt, these intermediaries lost credibility. The empire increasingly depended on the army and civil service alone. This militarization of governance increased costs and reduced flexibility. Each enforcement action generated further resistance, requiring additional enforcement. Internationally, the decree damaged Britain's global standing. At the Paris Peace Conference, British delegates advocated self-determination for Europe while suppressing it in Asia. Anti-colonial movements cited India as evidence of imperial hypocrisy. Within Britain, parliamentary debates revealed unease but no willingness to relinquish control. The empire chose continuity over reform, underestimating the cumulative effect of resistance. The long-term transformation was structural. Indian nationalism shifted from elite petitioning to mass mobilization. The Indian National Congress expanded from a consultative body into a national movement. British intelligence reports increasingly described India as ungovernable without concessions. Subsequent reforms, the Government of India Act 1935 among them, were attempts to regain control through decentralization. They failed because the fundamental relationship had changed. The Rowlatt Acts were repealed in 1922, but the damage was permanent. Trust had collapsed. The British Empire could still command obedience, but it could no longer command belief. Every subsequent crisis, economic depression, war mobilization, constitutional negotiation, was filtered through the memory of 1919. The decree had taught a population the mechanics of imperial power and the limits of imperial restraint. By the time Britain faced its next global war in 1939, India was no longer a passive asset. It was a contested space requiring constant negotiation. The strategic calculus had shifted. Control now required consent, and consent was no longer freely given. When independence finally came in 1947, it was not the result of a single campaign or negotiation, but the cumulative consequence of decisions like Rowlatt, decisions that prioritized short-term control over long-term stability. The legacy of the decree endures as a case study in imperial governance. It demonstrates how legal authority, when detached from legitimacy, accelerates decline. It reveals that empires do not collapse solely from external defeat, but from internal contradictions exposed by policy choices. In 1919, Britain chose to rule India through fear rather than reform. The silence that followed was not submission. It was the sound of consent being withdrawn, permanently.